In 1914, at great cost, her army barely saved France from another humiliating defeat by Germany, to add to the one in 1870. Over the next 2 years, the French army held its own, but the price it paid in the suffering of its soldiers was enormous. Even though it would go on to triumph in battle over the Germans in 1918, the decisive year for France's army was 1917. This is the story of how the French army nearly broke in that year, and how it recovered, and what all that means. When the front lines stabilized in the autumn of 1914, Germany occupied 4% of France's territory, but held 64% of pig iron, 24% of steel, and 40% of her coal production. For France, the strategic imperative of the war was simple: get the Germans out. To that end, the French army launched two great offensives in 1915, taking staggering casualties for very little gain. In the Champagne, the cost was 59,000 men wounded, captured, or killed for each kilometer retaken, and at Artois it was 30,000. In 1916, the French army, along with the British, tried again at the Somme and gained more and paid less, but the price was high enough: 17,000 casualties per kilometer for the French. To hold against the great German stroke at Verdun, the French army sacrificed 42,000 men for every kilometer of ground it was forced to give up. By the end of 1916, 1 million French soldiers had been killed, and another 2.3 million had been wounded. That was 18% of the entire male population of France. At the beginning of 1917, after all that suffering, the strategic problem had not changed. 3 groups of German armies occupied northern France, defying 4 French armies and 2 Allied armies to force them out. At the beginning of 1917, that seemed possible. The balance of forces was in the Allies' favor. The French and British armies had 177 divisions on the Western Front, and the German army only 133. But time for another big offensive was running out. The Germans had another 120 divisions on the Eastern Front fighting the Russians, who were near collapse. When Germany started moving its eastern divisions west, the strength would shift to them. The French also faced a tactical problem: new German defenses. Holding fast at the front line in 1915 and 1916 cost the Germans nearly as many casualties as they caused the British and the French. So they decided to move most of their men out of the front lines and defend in depth instead. In the new German defense, a German division fought with 3 regiments side by side, each regiment holding 3 lines. In the forward zone, there was 1 battalion from each regiment and 2 or 3 trenches. Up to 1,000 meters in front, there were outposts, manned by squads with machine guns. 3,000 meters behind the forward trenches was the battle zone, backed by 1 battalion and 2 or 3 trenches. In between were strong points, built for all-around fire, manned by more squads with machine guns. The 2,000 meters behind that was the reserve zone, with 1 battalion in 1 or 2 trenches. Then came the artillery to fire into the forward zone and the battle zone. For every 3 frontline divisions, there were 2 more divisions in the close rear as a counterattack reserve. The Germans' defense was not just deep, it was active too. Against an attack, a German regiment would fight this way. German artillery would cover the withdrawal of the outposts. If the French got into the front lines, a company, picked and practiced in advance, would counterattack to drive them out. If that failed, and the French drove into the battle zone, a company from the 2nd Line Battalion, also prepared in advance, would counterattack with artillery support. If that failed, the battalion in the 3rd line would move forward and counterattack. The French counted on artillery to overcome German defenses. As French generals put it, artillery conquers, infantry occupies. And in a way, they were right. As fearsome as the machine gun was, in World War I, 60 to 70% of casualties were from artillery. For their attack on the Chemin des Dames, the French gathered more than 5,000 artillery pieces. Heavy artillery was for breaking down fortifications and attacking the enemy's artillery. Field guns and trench mortars were for tearing up barbed wire and attacking enemy troops. The French also used their artillery to cover infantry attacks. In an attack, the infantry deployed in a front line and a support line and advanced behind a rolling barrage that moved forward on a schedule of 100 meters every 3 minutes. Protected by the barrage from machine gun fire and counterattacks, the infantry cleared out what was left of German trenches and strongpoints and moved on. But for troops held up by strong resistance, there was no way to make the rolling barrage slow down. Separated from their artillery fire, French infantry were very exposed. After 2 years of failure and loss, the French turned to a new commander to break the stalemate. Robert Nivelle was an articulate and immensely self-confident gunner with a brilliant record. He started the war as a colonel commanding an artillery regiment. 2 years later, he commanded an entire army at Verdun. There, he recaptured forts Douaumont and Vaux, using what was then a new artillery tactic called the rolling or creeping barrage. His claim that he had mastered the tactics to force a decisive breakthrough propelled him to command of the entire French army, replacing Joseph Joffre, the general who had led the army since the start of the war. Nivelle began planning his great breakthrough right away. He chose to attack across the Aisne River along the Chemin des Dames, a place where the Germans were very strong. They'd been fortifying it for 2 years, and aware of Nivelle's plans, had been moving new divisions into the area for weeks. Many of Nivelle's commanders believed the offensive would fail at high cost. One of his division commanders said, "The forthcoming operations can only have a restricted tactical result. We shall certainly capture guns and prisoners, but only at the price of the heaviest sacrifices." But that did not trouble the commander-in-chief. The more his plan was criticized, the bolder he got. Still, he was sensitive to losses. He swore he would not get caught in the kind of massive battering attack that cost the British 420,000 dead and wounded on the Somme in 1916 for only 12 kilometers gained. He even promised to cancel the operation after 48 hours if the initial attacks failed. The Chemin des Dames was a road that ran along a ridge north of the Aisne River. The ridge rose 400 steep feet from the valley floor, and it was cut with deep ravines, full of caves, and covered with trees. Behind that ridge were 2 more, just as tall, jumbled, and steep. Nivelle planned to attack along a 40-kilometer front that was defended by 36 German divisions with 6,000 machine guns and 1,700 artillery guns. The first German line was at the base of the first ridge with troop shelters in the caves. The second line was behind the crest of the first ridge. There were 3 more lines behind the crest of the second ridge and another line on the third ridge. Everywhere, the German defenses ran 8 to 10 kilometers deep. Against all that, Nivelle sent the 5th and 6th Armies, 28 divisions with 14,600 machine guns and 5,400 artillery guns. They were to overcome the German defenses, and then the 10th Army, with 12 divisions, was to break through towards Laon. Nivelle planned artillery attacks up to 8 kilometers in depth to hit the German front lines, strong points, second line, and artillery positions. After 10 days of bombardment, the infantry was to advance rapidly behind a rolling barrage, bypassing German holdouts. The objective was a 10-kilometer advance on the first day and another 15-kilometer advance on the day after that. The opening French artillery attacks lasted 10 days, and they failed. The first German lines were undamaged in front of 11 of 27 attacking divisions. There was hardly any damage to the German rear lines. There were not enough guns or time for hundreds of targets in 320 square kilometers of rough terrain. The French used 1.7 guns per square kilometer per day, even fewer than the 2.3 the British had on the Somme. Caught in front of the forward trenches or among the strong points on the slopes, the infantry could not keep up with the creeping barrage. The German machine guns came out from cover to cut the French apart. British liaison officer E.L. Spears observed, as soon as the infantry and the barrage became disassociated, German machine guns were conjured as if by magic from the most unlikely places, in many cases from both front and flanks, and sometimes from the rear as well. Nivelle broke his promise and continued the attacks for 34 days. They gained no more than 6 kilometers. French casualties were 31,000 per kilometer gained, almost as much as the 35,000 per kilometer gained the British suffered on the Somme. The surviving French soldiers felt deeply betrayed. Early in April, a British officer described the French army this way. Their morale was high as hope itself. But the futile losses on the Chemin des Dames were too much. They provoked a wave of civilian protests and outrage in the French Chamber of Deputies, and they brought almost half the army to the brink of mutiny. Starting late in April, regiments in the rear refused to go into the line. Later, regiments in the line refused to attack. Men in many regiments gathered in protest, shouting, "Down with the war." Some tried to go to Paris to meet with their deputies. But in the end, they allowed the military police to turn them back. Otherwise, soldiers kept to military discipline. They did no harm to officers and non-commissioned officers, and no damage to army property. There were no mass desertions. It was not a mutiny, as it has since been called. It was, in the term the generals used at the time, an outbreak of episodes of collective indiscipline. French soldiers demanded 3 things: more leave, better food, and fewer pointless casualties. The leave policy was 7 days every 4 months, but leave was canceled repeatedly. Good units were used more and had more cancellations. Many had no leave for 18 months. To be so close to home and have no chance to go and have no relief from the grinding losses in the trenches or the wastage of the grand offensives was almost unendurable. The French army took poor care of their soldiers. The food was awful. A typical meal was, in one soldier's account, a mix of gristle with pasta or rice forming a rubbery magma, or with white beans more or less cooked, or spuds more or less peeled, in a liquid brew which assumed the form of a bed of curdled grease. Pay was low. There was no food, transport, or shelter for soldiers traveling on leave. Medical care was bad. Above all, what troubled the troops was the waste of lives in offensives that were inept fantasies of grandiose ambition. As one private put it, each new attack was another terrible threat, new suffering, great dangers, the prospect of an awful death in a vain and useless sacrifice, because no one trusted the outcome of this new butchery. To save the army in the war, the country turned to General Henri-Philippe Benoni Omer Joseph Pétain. Pétain was big, imposing, cool, and progressive. He was a thorough planner and organizer. He was an infantry officer with a lifetime of leading troops behind him, who was also an expert in artillery. He had a superb record in the war as well. In 1914, he was a brigade commander, and in 1916, he was commander of the Second Army. He stopped the Germans at Verdun in the bloodiest battle of the entire war. He replaced Robert Nivelle as commander-in-chief in May 1917. Pétain promised no more big offensives, only limited attacks carried out, as he said, economically with infantry, and with a maximum of artillery. He issued orders for 10 days of leave for each soldier every 4 months. He improved leave trains and station facilities. He built rest camps, trained cooks, and added fresh fruits and vegetables to daily rations. He visited nearly every division in the Army to explain his plans, admonish junior officers, listened to questions from the men, take advice, and award medals. He also moved forcefully to return the Army to full discipline. The Commander-in-Chief will protect with his authority all those who display vigor and energy in suppression, he said. About 23,400 soldiers were arrested, tried, and convicted for collective disobedience. Most received punishments in their own units and returned to duty, but 2,800 went to prison and 629 were sentenced to death. Only 43 of those sentences were carried out. The Army recovered quickly. The 77th Division is an example. Mutinous in May and June, it was sent to one of the new rest camps. The ringleaders were tried and punished. Then the division was put back online in the Chemin des Dames. On July 19th, it held off an assault by 4 German divisions, even counterattacking to regain lost ground. Over the rest of the year, Pétain made a series of careful attacks. They had limited objectives, concentrated artillery preparations, and close coordination between advancing infantry and the rolling barrage. Casualties and gains were modest, but they restored the general's confidence in the army, and equally important, the army's confidence in the generals. By the end of the year, the French army was fully back in the war. Through the rest of the war, the French army stood to its duty. There were more casualties, another 160,000 dead in 1917 and 309,000 more in 1918. But there were no more acts of collective resistance. Why did the French soldier keep on fighting? He fought for the reason nearly all soldiers fight, for the men around him. He would endure the mud, the lice, the shelling, the struggle through the wire, the machine gunning in the open, the grenading in the trenches, the shelling, and again the shelling, because he must keep faith with his comrades. And he fought because he was forced to. He was a conscript subject to military discipline, drafted into service, and ordered into battle. But he was also a citizen of France. He believed by right that he must be led but not driven, and that his life could be used but not wasted. And that is the lasting significance of the mutinies. They helped determine the way a mass army in a modern democracy waged war. Soldiers had an obligation to obey and even to sacrifice, but their leaders had a duty of competence and care. The French, British, and American armies that beat the Wehrmacht in Western Europe in 1944 and 1945 were much better equipped and led as a result.